Did you ever notice anything unusual about their pool? David asked carefully. Not really, she said, thinking. They didn't use it much in later years. I remember it being beautiful when they first built it. Frank was very proud of that pool. He did most of the planning himself, worked closely with the contractors. This caught David's attention. If Frank had been heavily involved in the pool's construction, he would have known about the safe installation. Another neighbor, an old man named Bill, had more interesting information. Frank was a successful businessman, he told David. Had money, you know? But he was also very careful with it. This was back in the 60s when things were different. Some people didn't trust banks as much as they do now. What do you mean? David asked. Well, Frank came here from China originally. He built his business from nothing. Maybe he wanted to keep his valuables close to home, where he could control them. Can't say I blame him. The pieces were starting to make sense. Frank Chen had been a successful restaurant owner who preferred to keep his valuables secure at home. Building a safe into his pool would have been clever. Nobody would think to look there. David spent the evening researching safes from the 1950s and 1960s. He found several similar models in online antique catalogs. Most were designed for home use, meant to protect important documents and small valuables from fire and theft. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that this wasn't anything sinister. Frank Chen had simply been a careful man who wanted to protect his family's important belongings in an unconventional way. But knowing why the safe was there didn't solve David's main problem. He still couldn't open it. The combination had died, with Frank Chen, and Margaret had moved to a retirement home across town. David decided his next step would be to contact Margaret directly. She was the only person left who might know the combination or at least know what was inside the safe. He found the retirement home's phone number and called that evening. The receptionist was hesitant to give out resident information, but when David explained about the house and the discovery, she agreed to pass along a message. Mrs. Chen is still sharp as a tack, the receptionist said. I'm sure she'd be interested to hear from you. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon? She usually has visitors then. David agreed to visit the next day. As he hung up the phone, he felt excited and nervous. Soon he might finally learn the truth about the mysterious safe that had been hiding in his pool for over 60 years. That night, he stood in his backyard looking at the empty pool. Tomorrow, he might finally solve the mystery that had taken over his simple renovation project. Whatever was in that safe, it had been important enough for Frank Chen to go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. David couldn't wait to meet Margaret and hear her story. David arrived at Sunset Manor Retirement Home the next afternoon, carrying a folder full of photos he had taken of the safe. The building was nice, clean, bright and welcoming. The receptionist, a friendly woman named Linda, smiled when she saw him. You must be David, she said. Mrs. Chen is expecting you. She's been excited about your visit all morning. Room 127, down the hall and to the left. As David walked down the corridor, he wondered what Margaret Chen would be like. The neighbors had described her as a quiet, private person. Would she be suspicious of him? Would she even remember details about a safe that had been hidden for so long? He knocked gently on the door marked 127. A clear, strong voice called out, "Come in!" Margaret Chen was a small, elegant woman sitting in a comfortable chair by the window. Despite being 89 years old, her eyes were bright and alert. She was dressed nicely with her gray hair neatly styled. When she saw David, she smiled warmly. You must be the young man who bought our house, she said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from her. Linda told me you found something interesting in the pool. David sat down and opened his folder. Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind me bothering you, but I discovered something during the pool renovation that I think you should know about. Handed her the photos of the safe. Margaret took them with steady hands and looked at each one carefully. As she studied the images, David watched her expression change. Her eyes grew wide, then filled with tears. Oh my goodness, she whispered, holding one photo close to her face. I had completely forgotten about this. Frank's safe. You knew about it? David asked gently. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Of course I knew. I helped him plan it. But that was so long ago. And after Frank died, I guess I pushed it out of my mind. She set the photos in her lap and looked out the window for a moment, clearly lost in memories. Would you like to tell me about it? David asked. I'm curious about why it's there. Margaret smiled sadly. Frank was a brilliant man, but he was also very cautious. You have to understand, we came to America in the late 1950s. Frank had nothing when he arrived from China. No money, no family, no connections. Everything he built with his own hands. She paused to take a sip of water from a glass. On her side table. By the early 1960s, Frank's restaurants were doing very well. We had saved quite a bit of money. And we had important documents, immigration papers, business contracts, property deeds. Frank didn't completely trust banks back then. He had heard stories of people losing everything during the Depression. David listened carefully, beginning to understand Frank's motivation. But it wasn't just about money, Margaret continued. Frank faced a lot of discrimination in those days. Some people didn't like that a Chinese immigrant was succeeding in business. There were threats sometimes, people who wanted to drive him out of town. This surprised David. He hadn't considered that the safe might have been protection against more than just theft. Frank decided we needed a place to keep our most precious things safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look. When we built the pool, he came up with the idea of installing the safe in the deep end. That's incredibly clever, David said. Margaret smiled. Frank was always clever. He worked with the pool contractor personally. They installed the safe during construction, then poured the concrete around it. From the outside, you'd never know it was there. What did you keep in it? David asked. Important documents mostly. Our immigration papers, the children's birth, certificates, Frank's business contracts, property deeds. We also kept some family photographs and a few pieces of jewelry that had been passed down through Frank's family. Margaret's expression grew sadder. And cash, of course. Frank always kept emergency money in case we needed to leave quickly. He never forgot what it was like to have nothing. David felt moved by this story. Frank Chen had been protecting his family in the only way he knew how. After Frank died in 2003, I just couldn't bear to think about the safe. Margaret continued. Too many memories. I had copies of most of the important documents by then, and the children were all grown and settled. I guess I just pretended it wasn't there. Do you remember the combination? David asked hopefully. Margaret thought for a long moment. Frank changed it a few times over the years, but I think the last combination was our wedding date combined with something else. Maybe our anniversary? Or one of the children's birthdays? She looked frustrated with herself. I'm sorry. It's been so long, and my memory isn't what it used to be. That's okay, David said. I'm just glad to know the story behind it. Margaret picked up the photos again. You know, there might be a way to figure out the combination. Frank kept detailed journals. He wrote down everything. Business, transactions, family events, even daily observations. He always said he wanted to remember every detail of our life in America. David's heart jumped. Do you still have his journals? Some of them, Margaret said. When I moved here, my son Richard took most of Frank's things to his house. He lives about an hour north of Phoenix. I could call him and ask if he still has the journals. Would you mind doing that? David asked. I'd love to return whatever is in the safe to your family. Margaret smiled. You're a good young man. Frank would have liked you. Yes, I'll call Richard tonight. If he has the journals, maybe we can find some clues about the combination. They talked for another hour. Margaret told David stories about Frank's restaurants, their children, and the life they had built in Phoenix. David learned that Frank had been a pillar of the local Chinese-American community, helping other immigrants start their own businesses. Frank always said that America gave him a chance to build something from nothing, Margaret said. He never forgot how grateful he was for that opportunity. As David prepared to leave, Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you for taking such good care of our house, she said. And thank you for wanting to return Frank's safe to the family. That means more to me than you know. David promised to stay in touch and wait for her call about the journals. As he drove home, he felt honored to be part of this family's story. What had started as a simple pool renovation had become something much more meaningful. That evening, David stood in his backyard looking at the safe one more time. Now it wasn't just a mysterious object anymore. It was Frank Chen's legacy, a symbol of one man's determination to protect his family and build a better life in a new country. Tomorrow, he hoped, Margaret would call with news about the journals. And maybe finally, they would be able to unlock Frank's safe and complete this remarkable story. David's phone rang at 9 o'clock the next morning. He recognized Margaret's voice immediately. "David, dear, I have wonderful news," she said, sounding excited. "I called Richard last night and he still has several of Frank's journals. He's driving down this afternoon to bring them to me." "That's fantastic," David said, feeling his heart race with anticipation. "Richard is curious about the safe too," Margaret continued. "He barely remembers it from when he was young. He'd like to meet you if that's all right." David agreed immediately. That afternoon he returned to Sunset Manor, this time carrying a notebook to write down any clues they might find. Richard Chen was waiting in his mother's room when David arrived. He was a man in his early 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. On Margaret's table sat 3 worn leather journals. "These are just from the early 1960s, Richard explained. "Dad kept journals his whole life, but Mom thought these would be the most relevant since that's when the pool was built." David sat down as Margaret opened the first journal. Frank's handwriting was neat and precise, with entries in both English and Chinese characters. "Here," Margaret said, pointing to an entry dated June 15, 1962. "This is when they started digging for the pool." Frank had written detailed notes about the pool construction, including meetings with contractors and decisions about design. David was amazed at how thorough Frank had been about documenting everything. "Look at this," Richard said, finding an entry from July 1962. "Dad wrote about having a special installation done during pool construction, but he was vague about the details." The entry read, "Spoke with Tony about special project. He understands the importance of discretion. Installation scheduled for next week when other workers are not present." Tony was the pool contractor, Margaret explained. A nice Italian man. Frank trusted him completely. They continued reading through the summer of 1962. Frank had documented every step of the pool construction, but he was always careful not to write specific details about the safe installation. Then Richard found something interesting in an entry from August 1962. "Safe installation complete. Tony did excellent work. Changed combination to new sequence. Must remember, our beginning, plus our blessing." "What do you think that means?" David asked. Margaret thought carefully. "Our beginning would be our wedding date. Frank always called our children our blessings." "When were you married?" David asked. "March 14, 1948, Margaret replied without hesitation. "And when were your children born?" Richard answered this one. "I was born in 1951, my sister Linda in 1954, and my brother Paul in 1957. David wrote down the dates. "So the combination might be 03 to 1448 plus one of the birth dates?" "Or maybe all of them," Richard suggested. Margaret shook her head. "The safe only had 3 number wheels. It couldn't be that many digits." They kept reading. In a September 1962 entry, Frank wrote about testing the safe's combination. The entry was mostly in Chinese, but Margaret translated the important parts. He says here that he practiced opening the safe to make sure he could do it quickly if needed. He mentions the numbers again, but he calls them the date we became one plus the date of our greatest joy. "Your greatest joy?" David asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Richard was our first child. After years of trying, we had almost given up hope. When he was born, Frank said it was the greatest joy of his life." Richard looked moved by this revelation. "So the combination might be your wedding date plus my birthday? March 14, 1948, and May 23, 1951, Margaret said. David did quick math. That could be Oro 3, 14, 23, or maybe 14, 48, 23, or even Oro 3, 23, 51. They found more clues in Frank's journals. In October 1962, he had written about updating his insurance policies and mentioned keeping the safe combination in the same pattern we always use. "What pattern did your father typically use for numbers?" David asked Richard. "He always wrote dates as month, day, year," Richard replied. "And he usually used 2 digits for everything." Margaret nodded. Frank was very consistent about that. So March 14, 1948 would be 03 to 1448, and May 23, 1951 would be 0523 to 51. But how do we combine them into 3 numbers for the safe? David wondered. They spent another hour going through the journals looking for more clues. Finally, Margaret found an entry from 1963 where Frank mentioned testing the safe combination again. "He writes here in Chinese that the combination is 3 parts of our story. Then he lists 3 numbers, but they're written in a code." Margaret studied the Chinese characters carefully. "This character usually means month, this one means year, and this one means blessing. So maybe it's month and year from your wedding plus something from Richard's birth?" David suggested. "March 1948 would be 0348, Richard said. "And if blessing refers to my birth year, that would be 51. So 034851, David asked. Margaret looked at the journal entry again. "That feels right. Frank always said Richard was our blessing, and he would have wanted that represented in the combination." David wrote down the possible combination, 034851. "Should we try it?" All 3 of them looked at each other nervously. After more than 60 years, they were about to discover what Frank Chen had hidden in his pool. "I think we should," Margaret said finally. "Frank would want his family to have whatever he put in that safe." Richard agreed. "Let's go to your house, David. It's time to open Dad's safe." An hour later, they all stood in David's empty pool, looking down at the mysterious safe that had started this whole adventure. Tony the contractor had agreed to help, bringing a portable light so they could see better. David knelt beside the safe and carefully turned the combination wheels. The first number, 03. The second number, 48. The third number, 51. He took a deep breath and tried to turn the handle. Nothing happened. "Try it again," Margaret said. "Sometimes those old safes are stubborn." David tried the combination again, making sure each number was aligned perfectly. This time, when he turned the handle, there was a small click. The safe door swung open. Margaret gasped. Richard leaned forward eagerly. Inside the safe, wrapped in plastic bags and carefully organized, were the treasures that Frank Chen had protected for over 60 years. "Oh, Frank," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You kept everything safe just like you promised." The safe door opened with a soft creak, revealing contents that had been protected underwater for over 60 years. David carefully lifted out the first plastic-wrapped package while Margaret, Richard, and Tony watched in amazement. "Everything's so well preserved," David said, marveling at Frank's foresight. The plastic wrapping had kept everything completely dry despite decades of submersion. The first package contained documents. Richard carefully unwrapped them, revealing Frank and Margaret's original immigration papers from 1958. The documents were in perfect condition, as crisp and clear as the day they were issued. "I haven't seen these in so long," Margaret whispered, touching the papers gently. Frank was so proud of these. He used to say they represented our new beginning in America. The next package held more official documents, birth certificates for all 3 children, the original deed to the house, and Frank's business licenses for his restaurants. Each document told part of the story of a family building their American dream. But it was the third package that made everyone emotional. Inside were dozens of family photographs that Margaret thought had been lost forever. "Oh my goodness," she said, picking up a black and white photo of Frank standing proudly in front of his first restaurant. "I remember when this was taken. He was so excited that day." Richard looked through the photos with wonder. Many were from his childhood, showing family gatherings, holidays, and everyday moments that his parents had wanted to preserve forever. "Look at this one," he said, holding up a photo of himself as a young boy swimming in the very pool where they now stood. "I was probably 8 years old here." Frank took that picture the summer after the pool was finished, Margaret remembered. He was so happy to see you enjoying the pool. He never told you, but your laughter in that pool was one of his favorite sounds. David watched the family reunion with these precious memories and felt honored to be part of it. What had started as a simple pool renovation had become something much more meaningful. The next item in the safe was a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was a beautiful jade bracelet. This belonged to Frank's grandmother, Margaret explained, tears in her eyes. It was the only thing he brought with him from China. He always said it would go to our first daughter-in-law when Richard got married. Richard looked surprised. I never knew about this, Mom. Frank wanted to give it to you when you found the right person, Margaret said. Since you never married, I guess he kept waiting for the right moment. The safe also contained several bundles of cash, though the money was old and probably not worth much now. More valuable were the business contracts and financial records that documented Frank's success as a restaurant owner. Your father was quite successful, David observed, looking through the business documents. He was, Richard said proudly. But he was always modest about it. He preferred to help other families get started rather than show off his own success. At the bottom of the safe, David found one more item, a leather-bound notebook that was different from the journals they had. Read earlier. This one was smaller and seemed more personal. Margaret opened it carefully. This is Frank's private journal, she said. He wrote in this one when he wanted to record his deepest thoughts. She read from the first page, translating from Chinese to English. I am writing this in 1962, as we prepare our safe house beneath the pool. If someone is reading this, it means I am gone, but my family has found what I left for them. Margaret's voice trembled as she continued reading. Everything in this safe represents what matters most to me. The documents show how far we have come. The photographs capture the joy we have shared. The jade bracelet connects us to our ancestors. But most importantly, this safe itself shows how much I love my family and want to protect them always. Everyone was quiet for a moment, moved by Frank's words from beyond the grave. The journal continued with Frank's hopes and dreams for his children and future grandchildren. He wrote about wanting them to remember their heritage while embracing their American opportunities. He ends by saying that whoever finds this safe should know that it was built with love and hope for the future, Margaret concluded. Richard wiped his eyes. Dad always talked about legacy and family, but I never realized how deeply he felt about it. David carefully helped them pack everything back into waterproof containers. This all belongs to your family, he said. I'm just glad I could help reunite you with it. Margaret shook her head. Frank would want you to have something too. You made this discovery possible. She reached into the wooden box and pulled out a gold pocket watch that had been wrapped with the jade bracelet. This was Frank's business watch, she said, placing it in David's hands. He carried it every day for 40 years. I think he would want someone who appreciates family and history to have it. David tried to protest, but Margaret insisted. Frank believed in honoring people who do the right thing. You could have opened this safe yourself and kept everything. Instead, you sought out the rightful owners. That's exactly the kind of person Frank would want to have his watch. The watch was beautiful, with an engraved case and a face that still kept perfect time. On the back was an inscription in both English and Chinese. Time is precious, but family is eternal. That evening, after the Chen family had carefully packed away their recovered treasures, David stood alone in his pool area. The safe was still there, now empty but somehow still meaningful. He decided to leave it in place as a reminder of the story it had protected. Tony finished the pool renovation 2 weeks later. The new tile work was beautiful, and the water was crystal clear. But David's favorite feature was the small memorial plaque he had installed near where the safe sat, honoring Frank and Margaret Chen and their remarkable story. Margaret visited often after that, usually bringing one of her children or grandchildren to see the pool and hear the story of Frank's safe. David learned that the family had used the recovered documents to trace more of their genealogy and connect with relatives they hadn't known about. Richard eventually got married at age 65, and Margaret was able to give his bride the jade bracelet that had been waiting in the safe for decades. The wedding reception was held in David's backyard, around the pool that had kept the family's treasures safe for so long. David still carries Frank's pocket watch every day. Sometimes people ask him about it, and he tells them the story of the safe in the pool. He always ends by saying that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or money, but the love and memories that families create together. The pool is beautiful now, exactly what David had dreamed of when he first bought the house. But he knows that its real value isn't in the renovation work or even in the swimming and entertaining it provides. The pool's true worth lies in the story it protected and the family it helped reunite. Every time David floats on his raft on a hot Phoenix afternoon, he thinks about Frank Chen and his determination to protect what mattered most. The safe may be empty now, but the pool is full of something much more valuable. The legacy of a man who understood that family and love are the only treasures really worth protecting.